Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Axel Santana, an associate at PolicyLink and chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus. We're excited to be joining our first webinar of 2024. Today, we're co-hosting with the Urban Institute. The topic is federal funding, infrastructure investment, advancing equity. They've put out a great report with some really interesting research that they'll be sharing with you today. We're excited to dive into the topic. They'll present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes, 20 minutes or so for any questions and discussion. So as they're speaking, if things come up in terms of questions and things you want to know more about, please feel free to use the Q&A function to jump in and share your questions, and we'll get to them at the end. And so with that, I will start us off and pass it over to the Urban Institute team. And you can all introduce yourselves as you speak.
Hey everyone, my name is Yona Freemark. I'm a researcher at Urban Institute, and I'll be starting off this presentation today. I have four of my colleagues here today, and they'll present themselves or introduce themselves when they begin talking. Before we begin, I'd like to note that we are all researchers on staff at Urban, but Urban itself does not take positions on issues. We are talking for ourselves here. In addition, I would like to note that we were funded by the Melville Charitable Trust to undertake this research. So I'm going to talk today about how infrastructure investment can advance equity and what we know about the progress in federal infrastructure investment so far in doing so. So let me begin by setting the context for our project. The federal government, of course, has substantially expanded its investments in infrastructure over the past few years, especially because of the passage in 2021 of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. With this investment has been a commitment from the government to focus spending in the neediest communities, particularly those where people of color and families with low household incomes predominate. This has been illustrated by the administration's Justice 40 commitment and federal agencies' equity action plans. And it's something that we've seen many localities and states also taking increasingly seriously, as you see from this example here from Philadelphia. So in theory, these infrastructure investments and their focus on high need or historically under-resourced communities should result in a more equitable society. But as we know, too often, infrastructure has been used to separate and destroy. One of the most prominent examples is the way that the federal government used urban renewal associated with the federal highway program to destroy many of our country's Black and brown urban neighborhoods and community spaces. This raised a question for us then. Are the federal government's infrastructure investments targeting the communities that most need support? We are interested in exploring that question across a variety of programs. So we've been examining the distribution of federal infrastructure spending. We're trying to answer three fundamental questions. Number one, is federal investment concentrated in jurisdictions like counties and states that face historic underinvestments? In other words, is it headed towards the places with higher shares of people of color and many families with low incomes? Second, are awarded projects located in tracts with higher concentrations of people of color? In other words, are the neighborhoods where projects are located different than other similar neighborhoods in the same place? And third, are counties with limited local staffing capacity receiving a fair share of funds? In other words, is every county or state treated fairly by the federal entities when it comes to funding distribution? So before we detail our results, I wanted to begin with a quick preview of a few key findings we'll talk about today. So number one, federal fundings tend to reinforce historic spending patterns. That means they reward communities with funds based on decisions many made decades ago. This is especially true for programs with funds distributed via formulas, some of which themselves were written several decades ago. Second, competitive grants, which are awarded by executive agencies like the Department of Transportation, do tend to support communities of color. That's really good news in terms of the department starting to achieve some of its equity goals. However, those competitive grants sometimes underfund communities with low household incomes. One key explanation for that is that those low-income communities have a harder time staffing their governments. And indeed, we find that funding from some programs is currently biased toward communities with more local staffing capacity. This is important evidence that we need better capacity support for many low-income and low-staffed communities throughout the country. So I'll now pass to Amanda, my colleague, to outline our approach.
Thanks, Yona. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you. I am Amanda Hermans. I am a research analyst in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And I was an analyst on this work as well, and continue to be an analyst on our work going forward. So I will share a little bit with you about our approach to this research. So this graphic here on the screen begins to illustrate our approach. In this work, we focused on federal grants from two major sources. First, we looked at large grants from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which, as you know, was passed in 2021, and funds programs through several agencies, including the Department of Transportation, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Commerce, among others. So for IIJA, we looked at 58 of the largest programs that will distribute over $1 billion over the course of the bill's 5-year lifespan. The vast majority of these funds are distributed through federal formula, though about 20% of the funding that we studied was distributed through competition. In total, we studied about half of the total FY22 IIJA spending, partially due to that $1 billion threshold and partially due to a slow appropriations process. Not all of the funding announcements had been made by the time we began our analysis. And then second, we also looked at grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And though HUD did not receive any funding from IIJA, we believe that housing is an important element of the nation's overall infrastructure system. And because of that, we thought it should be included in this evaluation. And we hope that this work can actually help build some consensus that housing is infrastructure. So for HUD, we studied 8 programs that distributed at least $1 billion in FY22, amounting to about 98% of HUD's total spending in that year. Most of these programs were distributed by formula or block grant, and only the Continuum of Care program was distributed by competition, and even that is a bit of a unique competitive program in the way it's structured. So we do want to be clear that we have more to say about competitive programs from IIJA than from HUD. We also want to emphasize that this investigation may be more relevant to different actors depending on the funding mechanism. Specifically, our conclusions related to formula programs may be more relevant to congressional deliberations, while those related to competitive ones may be more relevant to the executive agencies who are making those award decisions. And this is an important distinction that we try to emphasize throughout our work. So for all of these programs, we mapped awards to counties and states and assessed them in terms of whether the distribution of grant money was supporting equity goals. And to do this, we developed a suite of 59 indicators, which are data points that tell us critical information about a jurisdiction's characteristics. Some of these were basic demographic indicators, such as share of population who are people of color, the poverty rate, or the median household income of the jurisdiction. Other indicators told us specific things about a jurisdiction's potential need for investment from these programs. In the case of transportation indicators, for example, we looked at things like number of highway miles, number of public transit stops, and commute time. And as you'll see in the findings section that follows, we then compared the jurisdiction's relative funding levels to their relative need along these indicators. Now, there are plenty of other organizations out there who are also cataloging federal grant funding, and specifically IIJA, including, I'm sure, some of the members on this call and some members of the Transportation Equity Caucus who we've recently spoken to, including Safe Routes Partnership and Transportation for America. We see our approach as unique on 2 fronts. For one, for grants that were awarded by competition that involved a specific project, we used geospatial software to manually map the exact project locations of those proposed projects. So this means we can identify the specific neighborhoods that will be impacted by the project, which goes beyond the data that are currently available from invest.gov or USA Spending. Second, we created this series of indicators that I spoke about earlier to assess the degree to which a project funding is supporting increased racial and social equity, as well as meeting other indicators of local need. This development of local indicators is special because it allows the public policymakers and advocates to assess every program on many different fronts. So now that Yona has given you a preview of our findings overall, and I've given you some background on the methods we used, me and my colleague Tomi are going to share some illustrative results. And I say illustrative because there are quite literally thousands of ways that people can interpret all the data that we accumulated. And as we'll discuss later, our interactive website that we built as part of this project is a great tool that can allow users to explore all of those various combinations for themselves. But the examples we'll give here will provide some of our main takeaways, which we detailed in our report, and will hopefully help inform our discussion. So let me begin with some of our findings on the formula programs, specifically by returning to this issue of federal programs reinforcing historic patterns. And what I mean by this is that decisions often made decades ago, some of which we know have harmed communities of color or reinforced patterns of segregation, are being maintained by federal policy today. Consider the Surface Transportation Block Grant, one of the larger formula programs that we looked at. This chart shows that this program distributes almost twice the amount of funding to states with the highest rates of driving than to those with the lowest rates of driving. And in some ways, this may seem intuitive. The states with higher annual vehicle miles may need more money to keep their roads maintained from higher usage. But it's also one example of how historic decisions by Congress about where roads should be built are still impacting the distribution of federal funds today. This means that places that lack connectivity might not be getting the funding that they need to build new roads or other forms of transportation infrastructure. And given the flexible uses allowed for these funds, for example, states can opt to use them for public transit, pedestrian, or bike projects, it may be locking communities with lower rates of driving out of their fair share of flexible transportation funds. Next, we'll look at a formula program geared more towards public transit. We found that formula transit programs tended to send more money to jurisdictions with higher incomes. You can see here that the urbanized area formula program, which is designed to support public transit projects, sent 3 times the amount of funding to counties with the highest median household incomes than to the counties with the lowest median incomes. This result raises some major concerns about the formula used to distribute transit funding. By prioritizing things like population density, existing transit service, and existing transit ridership, this formula may be inadvertently providing a funding preference to counties with higher incomes. And this may be preventing lower resource communities the opportunity to develop new or strengthen existing transit options. Next, consider the way that some large federal formula programs distribute funding across states. Here, we're showing a map of funding through the National Highway Performance Program. You can see here that the states receiving the highest levels of per capita funding, or the darker colored states, such as Montana and Wyoming, are also the states with some of the lowest shares of people of color. Whereas states with the highest shares of people of color, such as California, New York, or Illinois, are receiving much lower levels of per capita funding. Those latter states also have far higher rates of people using public transit, walking, or biking to work, all of whom could possibly benefit from NHPP funds that were flexed for those modes. Moreover, what this shows is that NHPP funding formula is not explicitly set up to distribute funds in a way that advances racial equity. Instead, the 5 states with the highest shares of people of color are receiving only 55% of the per capita funding of the 5 states with the smallest shares of people of color. I will note, though, that these trends look very different based on the different programs that we evaluated. Some of the housing programs, like public housing investments, for example, are more oriented to communities of color. Now, everything I've just described applies to some of our findings on formula programs, which are distributed according to rules set by Congress or federal agencies. But as you know, a substantial share of federal infrastructure funding is also distributed by competition using merit-based scoring processes. So I'm now going to pass to my colleague Tomi, who will walk you through some of our findings on competitive programs.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everybody. I'm Tomi Reininger. I'm a research assistant at Urban Institute as well. And I'm going to share some more specific findings about our analyses of competitive programs. So in theory, these competitive funds offer a considerable opportunity to achieve equity goals, since cabinet secretaries can choose to route funding to specific areas. But in reality, for most programs, competitive funding is very rare. In 2022, over 90% of counties across the country received no funding from most competitive programs we examined, such as those that are listed on this slide. And HUD's Continuum of Care program, which reached the most counties of those listed here, still only reached 23% of counties. Even so, we do find that in general, the federal government is providing higher levels of competitive funding to communities with more people of color. So consider the All Stations Accessibility Program, for example, which is designed to improve the accessibility of rail stations. As you can see here, the typical county with the highest shares of people of color received funding that was an order of magnitude higher than those counties with the lowest shares. And that difference applied whether we looked at all counties or just those in urban areas. And we found similar outcomes looking at a number of competitive programs across agencies we studied. And this all suggests that competitive programs are being designed to address historical racial inequities. This pattern persisted as well when we looked at neighborhood level funding. So for the RAISE program, for example, projects were on average located in census tracts that have significantly higher shares of people of color than other tracts in the same county. We saw similar results for other subsets of transportation projects, such as road capacity projects or bike and pedestrian projects. However, while this may demonstrate significant investment in communities of color, it's also important to consider possible negative externalities of these infrastructure projects. For example, projects that increase road capacity located in communities of color could also place disproportionate burdens of air and noise pollution on those communities as well. And despite the fact that competitive programs do seem to be significantly funding communities of color, we are still concerned that competitive programs from the federal government may be underfunding communities with low incomes. So here we show that counties with higher median household incomes receive substantially more funding on average than counties with lower incomes. And this is, as an example, from the competitive low or no emission vehicle program. So this trend was consistent across competitive programs we studied from a variety of different agencies. And it should worry us about some inherent biases in the way the federal government is distributing dollars, because it may be overly benefiting some types of communities over others, such as communities with fewer resources. And in our analyses, we conducted multivariate regressions to analyze these data and ensure that they reflect reality. We found that even when we control for other local conditions, such as population density or share of people of color, income continues to explain a large share of why some counties get more funding than others. The Reconnecting Communities program just offers another example of how the federal government may be underfunding communities with low incomes. So as you can see on this slide, the funding for Reconnecting Communities is concentrated in urban counties, but you can see that urban counties with the lowest median incomes are receiving almost zero funds. Now, in addition to the demographic indicators that we've just talked about, such as share of people of color and income, for every program we examined, we also looked at some combination of over 50 other state and local indicators that tell us something about whether programs are funding communities with the highest local needs. So fundamentally, we wanted to see whether these initiatives are targeting the communities that have characteristics that suggest they may need more infrastructure investment beyond just their demographic makeup. And here, for example, we show what we refer to as equity scores for the Urbanized Area Transit Formula Program. And what these positive equity scores show is that funding for this program is disproportionately concentrated in counties with high rates of transit use and with less car travel for the typical family, all of which are indicators that suggest the need for more public transit investment. So in this way, the program is addressing local need. And we provide similar metrics for every program we examined across many different indicators. And I should say that these scores vary tremendously based on the program we're looking at. And users are able to explore this for themselves through our interactive website, which Gabe will discuss in a minute. But first, the final element we explored was the relationship between local bureaucratic capacity in terms of the number of government staff in relevant sectors and a community's capacity to win competitive grants. And we found that on the whole, counties with more staff per capita are more likely to receive more funding from a variety of different programs. For the RAISE program shown here, for example, significantly more funding is going to counties with the highest number of per capita transportation staffers working in the local governments. And local staff capacity continues to be an important consideration, especially when paired with our finding that competitive funds tend to go to counties with higher median incomes. And it's likely that low-income counties simply do not have the ability to raise the tax dollars needed to hire adequate staff. But if lower resource counties are losing out on opportunities for funding because of this limited capacity, this may deepen existing inequities rather than remediate them. And now I will pass it to my colleague Gabe to discuss where these data are available and some key recommendations.
Thank you, Tomi, and hello, everyone. My name is Gabe Samuels, and I'm a research analyst at the Urban Institute as well. And so some of you may have already read our report and maybe even played around with our interactive tool prior to this call. But for those that haven't, I want to reiterate that all of these findings and more can be found in the 2 products that we released to the public on urban.org last October. So our report contains a summary of our findings, including and in addition to those that we've shared today. But our interactive site is a resource for anyone who is interested in exploring some of this data for themselves. It's a dynamic site, will be updated in the coming years, and it allows users to explore the distribution of federal infrastructure funding by program, county, or state, and includes data for all 66 programs that we analyzed across all of our 59 equity indicators, in addition to the more than 3,000 US counties in all states, DC, and Puerto Rico. It's an exciting resource that we're looking forward to updating over the coming years as more funding is distributed. We can actually take a look at the tool right now together to give a quick overview of how it can be used. So allow me to show this. Can everyone see the tool on their screen? Great. So here's the homepage, right? We have a little blurb, a little baseline map highlighting where programs are administering funds on a per capita basis. You're welcome to explore any of these programs, but for this exercise, we want to take a look, at Safe Streets and Safe Roads for All, or SS4A, which is a program that I'm sure many of you on the call today have some interest in. So if you hover over this map, you can see that a lot of funding went to states in the northwestern US, like Washington, Oregon, Montana, North Dakota, as well as a few states in the Midwest and in the Northeast, particularly Rhode Island, which you can actually see here, got about $30,000 in FY22, which is the most money in the US that year. And so we can take a closer look at the full program analysis on this page. And so you can see kind of a deeper analysis, right, of each program that we reviewed. So SS4A right here, right, administered more than $800 million in FY22, but how equitably was that funding distributed? So we can answer that question with 2 of the 3 equity measures that we reviewed, the concentration measure and the high need equity measure. The variability measure applies only to the state level formula funded programs. So if we start looking at the concentration measure down here, this means the share of the program's funding going to jurisdictions with different characteristics. So SS4A went to counties with a high amount of public transit stops, as well as to counties with high car access per household. However, it may perform poorly when it comes to counties with low median incomes and high annual vehicle miles traveled per household. The high need equity measure, which we can select here, tells a slightly different story. This measures how close on median these high need jurisdictions, or those above the top 50th percentile for a given characteristic, are to receiving a level of funding that would meet their need. So across the board, it may seem that SS4A is not meeting the needs of the jurisdictions that could benefit the most from these funds, suggesting more can be done for this program to be more equitable. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can break down how the program distributes funding by counties based on these selected characteristics that are relevant to the program. So say we'll look at urban counties and starting with the share of population who are people of color, you can see a considerable amount of funding is going to counties with more than 34% of people of color. And you can also look at characteristics where we might expect or maybe hope that more funding would funnel to, such as, say, fatal accident frequency or annual vehicle miles per household. And you can get a sense of how that sort of breaks down by county. So I'm sure you're all thinking, this is awesome, but what am I supposed to take away from this? We understand, as Amanda said, there are truly hundreds, if not thousands of interpretations that can really be made from this data, and it's certainly overwhelming. And so, I want to welcome you all in your free time or right now to explore this tool as you like. You can look up any type of infrastructure, federal program, or geography, starting from the search bar. So say you just want to look at all bridge programs in general, we can look at roads and bridges. If you want to look at the bridge formula program, you can look directly at that program. Or if you want to look at Rockbridge County, Virginia, you can look there and really break it down however you'd like to look at it. I also want to add in the coming year, we're planning to expand these geographies even further to include metropolitan areas and congressional districts. And so our hope in presenting to you all today as experts and advocates in transportation equity is that you all explore this on your own and follow the lines of inquiry, that resonate, that stand out and deserve attention. We've already talked to a few folks in the caucus who are planning to build on this work, and we are more than happy to talk to additional groups who are interested in doing the same. So I'll go back to our presentation here. Start sharing. And so my colleague Sam will talk shortly about some of our internal plans to build off of this data, but we do have some recommendations that we've been sharing with federal agencies and other partners about how to move this work forward into the future. And so we have some major ideas about how to advance a more equitable society through infrastructure investment. Some of this work is going to have to come from the federal government, who we have been having conversations with. I'm sure many of you all are continuing to advocate to, while some of this work will come from outside organizations like Urban and yourselves who are here today. So first, we think there is more work to be done to prioritize the distribution of competitive funds to disinvested areas. We're particularly concerned about communities with a high share of people of color and with many families with low incomes. And this is going to require additional action on the part of executive agencies. Second, we think that Congress and federal agencies can work to increase the equity of the distribution of formula funds. The current rules, we think are too focused on rewarding communities for decisions that were made decades ago. We know we can do better than that. So we can use these funds to help communities that want to invest now, and we can combat exclusion in funding policies and practices. Finally, we think there's a special opportunity to expand support for low capacity communities, as we've mentioned. And so the Joint HUD-DOT Thriving Communities program is an exciting initiative that helps build up the sort of capacity for a limited number of communities. And filling this gap for a large number of cities is an area for potential growth and involvement from the philanthropic and research sectors. I want to shout out to the PERC initiative, Partnership for Equitable and Resilient Communities, which has started to undergo some of this work in a few cities across the country. So I'll pass it finally to my colleague Sam to talk about the steps that we are taking in 2024 and beyond to advance this work.
Thanks, Gabe. My name is Samuel Lieberman. I am a research assistant here at Urban, and excited to talk about how we're advancing this project forward. As you may expect, we already have some big ideas about how to move this work forward over the coming years. Our current research, as published, is limited to just the fiscal year 2022. We want to continue exploring how these trends develop over the coming years and loop additional programs into our analysis. These would include programs such as those in the Inflation Reduction Act and other housing programs such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. We're also interested in measuring a broader set of outcomes, such as those related to economic development. We're also looking forward to building off of our equity framework to conduct new analyses of specific federal programs. We will be examining the distribution of funds from the Surface Transportation Block program within several states and investigating whether distributions from the RAISE grant program have become more equitable over time, going back to when the program went by Tiger and even before that when it went by Build. We want to find data on these communities with low levels of capacity and determine means to assist them. Specifically, we are currently analyzing how additional capacity indicators may dictate federal investments. And we're working more closely with the Partnership for Equitable and Resilient Communities, as Gabe mentioned earlier, or PERC initiative, to offer direct guidance on identifying and applying to federal grant opportunities across the country. But we're also interested in hearing from you all. What information would you find most helpful in our ongoing work? So as we close here and open up for questions, we're interested in hearing suggestions for future analysis, inquiries to pursue, or general lines of thought we could explore that will help you all conduct your work. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you. And yeah, this is question time. Oh, floor open for questions.
Thank you, Urban Institute team. Really appreciate all of your work on this and the great presentations, very comprehensive, and really highly recommend everyone to go check out the research in more detail. Before we start turning to the participant Q&A questions, folks, just a reminder, please put in your questions in the Q&A chat or any sort of other suggestions as well. I don't believe everybody has chat capabilities, so if you have things that you want to answer, feel free to put it in the Q&A as well, and we'll make sure that the Urban Institute team gets it. One question I have for you all is as you're sort of socializing this to the broader world and other advocacy groups and agencies, do you all have plans to talk to the DOT Advisory Committee on Transportation Equity? I feel like that would be a good opportunity for you all to share your findings there and discuss how they can help support the work within US DOT and other agencies.
Thanks, Axel. Yeah, so we actually have been able to speak already directly with folks in the DOT, in HUD, in the White House, and in the Department of Treasury about some of these results. We have not yet briefed the Equity Committee itself, as I believe it was actually just recently announced, but that is a group we would like to find a way to be introduced to, actually, because I don't know if we have a connection with them, but I think I agree with you. I think that would be a really good connection to make.
Awesome. Yeah, we do have folks connected. We're connected to Stephanie, who's the chair of that committee. So happy to make that connection as well, if that makes sense. So we do have a few questions coming through. Keep them coming. Excuse me. So we'll start with this first one. How does your research explore how investments do or do not financially benefit residents and WMBE firms located in areas where investments are made?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at answering that. And I think it's actually similar to the question that's next by Kevin Shen about how do you reconcile the location investments with the people who benefit? So let me start off talking about the fact that this is just our first year of results, actually. So we were looking primarily at the impacts on the residents of the surrounding area based on census information. So fundamentally, we were looking at what the demographic characteristics of those communities were. And so we were not looking at, for example, the overall users of a public transit line, for example. There could be people coming from all over a region who might use a new investment, but we weren't able to account for that in our first year of research. However, we did do some thought. We did have some thoughts about the variation in impacts based on positive and negative externalities. And I'm wondering if I could pass it to one of my colleagues, either Tomi or Amanda, to talk about what we tried to do related to that.
Yeah, I can answer this in a minute. I can't remember the exact number in the appendix, but I think it might be Appendix A of our report. There's a really long table that lists some types of programs like road capacity or bike and pedestrian, among many others. And it lists the potential positive externalities and potential negative externalities of each of those types of programs. So like I think I mentioned during my portion, road capacity projects could cause, excess air and noise pollution. So those are examples of what would be in that negative externalities column. And we also, in that table, added kind of a column indicating connection to racial inequity, potential racial inequity. So we didn't dive super deeply into these kind of resident level impacts in our report, just because of the scope of work and the time we had to conduct all of these analyses. But we did publish a sort of follow-on blog, I think in December of last year, that went into a specific example of like highway expansion projects and talked more about the importance of these externalities and why they're needed to be considered when thinking about like racial equity specifically in terms of the distribution of funding. So Amanda, not sure if you want to chime in at all.
Yeah, that's great on the externalities piece. I was just going to chime in about the thinking about like financial benefits, and I think we do recognize that that's like an area where we didn't develop our suite of indicators as fully as we did. Our indicators are mostly centered around the topic areas of transportation, housing, environmental impact, and there's a few broadband specific indicators and a few other odds and ends. But I think thinking more about economic development indicators and financial indicators is something that we're trying to add in this next round of research. So we can hopefully flesh out that piece a bit more then.
Yeah, just to add on quickly, one thing that we did show in our report was that, a lot of the, as we noted, a lot of the competitive funding is being distributed to communities, neighborhoods with a higher share of people of color than in the surrounding county, but that might have negative implications if the projects are investments that have a lot of negative externalities associated with them. So, for example, we do find that highway expansion projects are more likely to be in communities with a higher share of people of color, which I think should raise questions for folks out there about whether these projects are producing negative outcomes for people there.
Just one more thought on this topic, because I see Sarah Klein also submitted a question that's kind of along a similar pathway. And yeah, just want to highlight that this idea of local context and what is a benefit versus what might actually produce negative harm, even if it is an inflection of dollars, was really on our mind throughout this whole project. I think you'll see in the tool that our approach, because it's so complicated and like what is a benefit in one community might be a detriment in another community and vice versa, was to put all of these indicators out there and hopefully let local actors like use our tool and like interpret the tool for their specific context in whatever way might make the most sense to them. So we didn't do a ton of like explicit like value judgments, as it were, in terms of like what we considered a benefit. We just tried to gather as much data as possible that might relate to like needs for these specific programs and compile it in a way that is hopefully useful for folks out there. You might see a bit more of that interpretation that we do ourselves in our report to some extent, and I think we're thinking more about how to continue to do that into the future. But in terms of the tool, trying to make a blanket statement for the country overall is just really hard on a lot of these issues.
Thank you, and thanks to the participants for your questions. We have a few more here. The next question is, can you explain the high need equity measure that is shown on the interactive website?
Yeah, so we actually, it's a bit of a complicated measure that we spent a lot of time thinking about how it would work. And we actually do have a detailed explanation of both of our major equity measures in the report itself in the appendices. But to explain the high need equity measure in general, I'm going to try to explain it in a way that is not too complicated. But essentially what we do is we rank all the jurisdictions that we have in our database, either counties or states, based on some issue that we care about. So for example, share of people of color in a community, right? So we're ranking them all from 1 to 100 in the case of states, or 1 to like 3,000 in the case of counties. We then compare that ranking with the share of total money that each of those jurisdictions is getting. So essentially, if the money is being concentrated in the counties or states with a higher share of people of color, that high need equity number is going to be either positive or less negative. If, however, it is weighted towards, for example, counties or states that have a higher share of white people, it's going to be much more negative on that outcome. Now, I should say that we are continuing to refine our equity measures, and hopefully we'll make these easier to understand, because I'm aware of the fact that these are a little complicated. But I would say that folks using our website might find the concentration metric a little easier to understand, because essentially what it's evaluating is, for each program, what percentage of the counties with the top 25% of each issue, so for example, people of color, what percentage of total funding across the country are they getting? And that is what our concentration metric is trying to tell us. And that should tell us a little bit about whether the program is really oriented towards the jurisdictions that potentially need funding the most or not.
Also, sorry, just want to add quickly, if you go to the homepage on the website and scroll down to the bottom, there's a link to a user guide, which just has some like tips and tricks for navigating the website. And in that, if you scroll down again, you'll see some similar explanations about the equity scores.
Thank you. So the next question is, as a consultant who occasionally works on grant applications for public sector clients, I'm curious whether you looked into the role of not just staff capacity, but grant writing budgets and grant wins.
You know, this is an interesting question because we are working with, as I said, you know, our funder is the Melville Charitable Trust, and they have a larger program called the Partnership for Equitable and Resilient Communities. And as part of that, they've actually funded some grant writing in a number of low-income communities throughout the country to help them fill the gap. However, we are actually trying to extend our capacity analysis right now with some additional data points, and I'll pass it to Amanda to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I think we're very aware of this like consultant grant writer position that exists out in the world. The issue is just like finding data on who has access to that kind of staff and capacity. As Yona said, Tomi and I are working right now on an extension of our capacity analysis. Originally, we just used some data on county level public staff numbers. And we're expanding that now to do some city or municipal level analysis with some new data sources that we've identified that have more detail on local revenue in different categories and local expenditures. And so we're currently doing some analysis to see how those correlate with funding received, essentially, and then also adding in at the county level some new data on the payroll, and hoping to get at kind of that payroll budget of local governments, as it were. So that's what we have access to now in kind of a comprehensive way, and so that's what we're using as like a proxy for capacity. But we know that there are many different factors to what capacity governments have, and also know that it's not always the local governments applying for these funds. Sometimes it's nonprofit partners, sometimes it's coalitions of different groups. And so, yeah, these are tricky to get a handle on, but hopefully our analysis can give kind of a broad idea of what's going on. And then obviously every local context is going to be different.
Thank you. I think your answer kind of got to a little bit of this, but let me know if there's anything else you'd like to add to the answer or the question that Natalie posed, which she says, expanding support for low capacity communities is an interesting topic to learn more about. Oftentimes it seems like the money follows folks who are already funded or have paid staff already working in the community. Do you have any suggestions for how to begin some foundational work that can be built from in the future to get these communities on the radar for funding to create this local capacity in less population dense communities, not urban?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think in our recommendations, we've kind of made a big recommendation to local federal agencies to start doing some of this work to make their application processes more accessible, whether that's through providing TA or technical assistance, or making the processes more streamlined, making it more clear what the expectations are in terms of what's submitted, so that communities who are going through these lengthy processes aren't wasting their time, and know, exactly what they should be including in their applications and stuff like that. So I think it's like a multifaceted issue where, some of this work has to come from federal agencies. Some of it, I think a lot of capacity building is done at the nonprofit level, like the PERC initiative that we are connected to, and others who can help be those grant writers, step in and help build capacity. But yeah, I'm not sure if any of my other colleagues have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say that other folks at Urban Institute are working directly with a few local communities, and hopefully that will continue to generate more information about how to build capacity. I think one of the challenges that I see is that the federal government has this Thriving Communities program, and that is supposed to support capacity building at the local level. Unfortunately, the reality is that it can only support so many communities. And so we need to come up with mechanisms that can serve many different communities simultaneously. That is one goal that we have at Urban Institute in general with a number of different of our projects. I would like to point you all to our spatial equity data tool, which is an interesting resource that anybody can use to input data about projects that they're proposing in their community and get some information about how that funding is being distributed and whether it's fair from the perspective of like locations in their state or their county, for example. But I would also say that we're trying to develop some additional tools right now. Like we're going to release a blog post detailing some work we're doing on developing a transportation accessibility tool where anybody will be able to put in information about a proposed transportation project and get information about whether it will expand accessibility to people in different parts of the community. So in theory, we're trying to help fill the gap with individual tools, being aware of the fact that it's a huge country with tens of thousands of individual localities, but hopefully we can still be cognizant of the gap that remains. And I think that's an issue that the federal government is going to have to think about.
That's really exciting. Looking forward to those tools, and happy to connect on those things. This next one is seems like more of a comment, but feel free to answer if you have any thoughts. From the local level, formula FHWA dollars have been harder for us to track than discretionary. And because they go through the regional NPO, we often feel the urban areas in the region, such as Philadelphia, doesn't get an equitable share compared to others in the region. Any responses to that?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So we actually, in the previous year of research, we did not look at those formula dollars for the exact reason that Lily points to, which is that it's really difficult to track. However, in our coming year of research, we are specifically tracking the distribution of funding across state resources in a number of case study states to identify the fairness of those funding allocations that go below the federal distribution level. And I'm actually wondering if, Gabe, you want to talk about an additional research project that we are planning for this year related to pedestrian accessibility?
Sorry, which are you referring to?
Oh, sorry, I'm referring to the idea of we got access to a database of transportation pedestrian access that is at the localized level, and we're thinking of doing an analysis of that. Sorry if I just answered for you.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I know which one you're referring to. So that's okay.
Okay.
Great. So we got a couple more. One that is not in the Q&A but is in the chat. You made a recommendation that the formula for formal funding gets changed. Do you have a recommendation on how the formulas could be changed?
Okay, so fundamentally, one thing we are aware of is that the major FHWA dollars, despite the fact that they can be used for virtually any transportation investment, just to give you an example, the NHPP, the National Highway Performance Program dollars, since 1991 can be used on public transportation along federal national highways, and they can be flexed over to transit, pedestrian, and bike uses nationwide. Despite that fact, those funds are massively oriented towards, as we noted in the presentation, states that have a higher share of folks driving by car, which essentially means that we're using these programs to reinforce automobile dependency, giving folks who drive a further subsidy for the pollution and other problems that they cause. So one fundamental change is at least incorporating for some percentage of the dollars a per capita adjustment. I mean, it may sound obvious, but fundamentally the NHPP and the other large highway formula dollars are not adjusted per capita. And so it's punishing the larger states for existing. And, I think that's something that we should be looking at. Another is that we currently don't have a system that rewards states and communities for doing things like shifting people out of high pollution modes or reducing highway fatalities. If we had a system by which the formula adjusted for those two changes over time and gave states and other communities that receive the funds more money in exchange for actually achieving goals, then I think we could see better outcomes. So we're going to hopefully be coming up with some ideas for formula changes over the next year that are a bit more specific, and we're going to model those out.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how does your research explore how investments drive displacement and gentrification and how these routine outcomes can be mitigated?
I can take a pass at that. I know we kind of talked about this earlier. I think the short answer is that it doesn't. Because we were looking at FY22 and because IIJA is still so recent, many of the projects that we were looking at haven't even been built yet. Going as far as an outcomes level analysis isn't quite possible yet. We're gonna have to wait a few years until we can get a good sense of what's actually resulting from these projects getting built. So our analysis was we consider it like a first step. We're looking at how the funding is getting distributed, looking at the equity of that process for now, and then hopefully in some future work, we can look more on the outcomes piece.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another comment question is, I noted the large jump in the graph on high capacity counties when you looked at all counties versus just urban counties. Does that suggest that the disparity between high capacity and low capacity areas receiving grants is dramatically worse in rural areas than in urban areas?
I think honestly, it really depends on the program. We see different trends for different types of programs. It's worth pointing out that some of the programs are designed for more urban counties, which is why we did this sort of differentiation. Just to give you an example, the All Stations Accessibility Program, which is designed to provide things like elevators to rail stations around the country, is not going to apply in a rural county. And so I don't know if we have identified an overall trend in this disparity, but we do see differences when you look at individual programs, which is interesting.
Definitely. And then to that point, the final sort of comment we have here is building on Todd Scott's comment. Some of the rail and highway safety programs are specifically aimed at eliminating at-grade railroad crossings and concentrating crossings in fewer places. This is rarely good for access and safety for people outside cars or trains. Any comments or thoughts on that before we wrap?
That's great insight. I did not think about that, and that's something I would love to think about in more detail and maybe incorporate it into our analysis. I don't know if any other team member has any thoughts.
I would say it emphasizes the fact that when looking at this data, really you want to look at it at the program level, because all these programs may have many different impacts, ways that they're implemented. So I think it's important to consider, right, not taking larger sort of observations and really getting down to how will each program actually manifest on the ground, is because it will be different. Definitely.
Great. Well, that takes us to the end of the questions. I will open it up to any of the panelists if there's any final remarks, thoughts, and things you want to leave us with before we close.
I think I'll just say that, I know that folks on the call are probably interested in these issues and want to nerd out about them the same way that we do. And we're always looking for feedback, especially as we consider what we're doing over the next couple of years. So please use our tool, play around in it, read a report if you have any interest to, and send us your thoughts. And we would love to connect further if you have anything that you'd like to discuss with us.
Perfect. Sounds great. Yes, I will be sure to share the links to the tools. Perhaps one of you can share one of your email addresses as well, and I'll keep that in the follow-up email as well. We'll share the recording and potentially the slide as well. So folks will have a nice packet of everything that was discussed today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation as part of the Transportation Equity Caucus as well. Please, connect with us and use us as a resource. We do have a federal policy working group as well for this year. So we'll be looking for opportunities like this to continue advancing equity through this work. So really appreciate you all, Urban Institute. Round of applause for you all. Thanks for making the time today and sharing this great tool, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks everybody for attending. You'll get the recording and links and other information shortly as well. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.